Hello viewers, today we'll be discussing the different theories of monopoly capitalism. Monopoly capital is a term often used in Marxian political economy as well as in many non-Marxist writings to refer to the new capital that is embodied in modern giant corporations that beginning in the last quarter of the 19th century displaced the small family firms as the dominant economic unit of the system, marking the end of the freely competitive system and beginning of monopoly capitalism. Marx's Capital, the first volume of which was published in 1867, was designed to uncover the laws of motion of the 19th century era of free competition and was based in part on the assumption that production was carried out by numerous capitals. Each of these capitals accounted for a negligible portion of the society's total output as well as society's total value added, and thus had little control over the price and output levels, which were dictated by impersonal market mechanisms. Yet, unlike other classical Marxists, Marx recognized that such an environment of atomistic competition was a transitory historical phenomena. The battle of competition, Marx wrote, is fought by the cheapening of commodities. The cheapness of commodities depends on the productiveness of labor and this again on the scale of production. Therefore, the larger capitals beat the smaller ones. Competition rages in direct proportion to the number and in inverse proportion to the magnitude of the rival capitals. Hence, Marx proposed that capital accumulation presupposed both a growth in the size of individual capitals as well as the fusion together of many capitals into a huge mass in a single hand. Moreover, the credit system, which begins as a humble assistant of accumulation, soon becomes a new and terrible weapon in the battle of competition and is finally transformed into an enormous social mechanism for the centralization of capital. Therefore, monopoly is a logical consequence of capitalism. It is believed that competition is in the DNA of capitalism. For Karl Marx, capital tended to grow even larger in a single hand, partly as the result of the straightforward process of concentration of capital as well as the result of centralization of capital. So, students, please remember that in this concept of monopoly capitalism, two very important concepts are the concentration of capital as well as the centralization of capital. In this struggle for capital, Marx wrote that the larger capitals as a rule beat the smaller ones. Competition would definitely rage in direct proportion. And what happens as a result? As a result of this competition, accumulation and centralization, it results in the ruin of the smaller firms and capitalists. And these capitals of the small capitalists pass on to the competitors and the large capitalist firms. Now, let us give a small snapshot of the evolution of monopoly capitalism. As Engels observed, that the rise of the joint stock company or modern corporation heralded the fact that the old boasted freedom of competition has reached the end of its tether and must itself announce its obvious scandalous bankruptcy. Therefore, there can be no doubt that Marx and particularly Engels recognize that a historical turning point has reached. Nevertheless, they saw the demise of free competition as marking not a new stage of capitalism but a harbinger of socialism to come. It was not until some years later in the work of subsequent theorists that studies of monopoly capitalism as a distinct phase in the evolution of the system arose. Let us move on to these theories on monopoly capitalism that actually created a rich literature on monopoly capitalism and its various conceptualization. We would start off with the analysis provided by Thorstein Veblen. Now, the first major theorist of monopoly capitalism was Thorstein Veblen, who was a rebel economist of the North American left, deeply influenced by Marx, but he himself was not a Marxist. In his famous work, The Theory of Business Enterprise and the Absentee Ownership and Business Enterprise in Modern Times, published in 1923, Veblen emphasized such characteristic themes of monopoly capital theory as the rise of corporate finance, the tendency of monopolistic profits margins to widen at the expense of less powerful firms and workers, the systematic promotion of excess capacity, and the interpenetration of sales and manufactures. These, according to Veblen, were the characteristic features of monopoly capitalism. However, Veblen's more powerful insights were largely ignored by his followers within institutionalist economics in United States of America. Consequently, it was only in the Marxist tradition, where Veblen's work was little known, that a continuing stream of work on monopoly capitalism began to emerge in the later years. Next, we come to Rudolf Hilferding. His landmark study, Finance Capital, published in 1910, attempted to integrate into the core of Marxist theory such increasingly important phenomena as the developing market for industrial securities, the growing role of banks in the concentration and centralization of capital, and the system-wide consequences of expanding monopolization in the world. Aside from the emphasis that he placed on bank capital in the whole development of monopoly capitalism, Hilferding's analysis is chiefly remembered for the outcome of monopoly capitalism. Let us try to understand what Hilferding had to say on the outcome of monopoly capitalism. The ultimate outcome of this monopolization would be the formation of general cartel. The whole of capitalist reproduction would be then consciously organized by a single body which would determine the volume of production in branches of industry. This is what cartels are, we already know. Hilferding's analysis had pointed to the growth of capital export and of transnational rivalry between huge corporate trusts. Hilferding recognized the link between capital markets and the fact that capital markets form the essence of monopoly capital. In his Finance Capital, Hilferding first put forward an explanation of a new kind of capitalist instability caused by the interplay between monopoly and competitive segments in the capitalist economies. He was of the view that corporations would stabilize their finances through access to the capital market and the use of monopoly power and cartels to secure a disproportionately large share of the surplus generated in the economy. So what we find, the monopoly capitalism, according to Rudolf Hilferding, gave rise to the institution of cartels and control of capital. His conclusion was that capitalism has now changed its mode of operation. Its structure, its dynamics was widely accepted by the Marxists, even if many rejected Hilferding's view that cartelization and the coordination of business activity can effectively stabilize the capitalist economy. Of Hilferding's intellectual legacy, his theory of imperialism and his distinction between classic and monopoly capitalism very broadly was accepted by Marxists such as Vladimir Lenin. Let us move on to another theory of capitalism put forth by Lenin. Lenin described capitalism as imperialism, and he conceptualized monopoly capitalism as the highest stage of capitalism. According to Lenin, monopoly capitalism, or imperialism as he calls it, distinguishes itself through 5 main features. They are: capitalism refers to the concentration of production and capital, which has developed to such a high stage that it has created monopolies, and these monopolies play a decisive role in economic life. Secondly, he focused on the merging of bank capital with industrial capital and the creation on the basis of financial capital or financial oligarchy. The export of capital, as distinguished from the export of commodities, acquired greater significance to Lenin. Fourthly, the formation of international monopolist capitalist associations which shared the world among themselves. And finally, most importantly, the territorial division of the whole world among the biggest capitalist powers is completed under monopoly capitalism. Let us now move on to another very important theorist whose work has become very popular in the discourse of monopoly capitalism, and that is Michael Kalecki. It is believed that within the mainstream theory in the 1930s had produced the theory of imperfect competition, and these theories of imperfect competition can be located in the works of Robinson and Chamberlain, followed by the theory of crisis by Keynes, which was based on the assumption of free competition, and these two strands of complete theory of accumulation under modern capitalism was cut off from each other. The first to unite them was the Polish Marxist economist Michael Kalecki, often credited with having discovered as early as 1930s the essentials of Keynes' general theory long before Keynes himself propounded the theory. In such later works as the essays in the theory of economic fluctuations and the theory of economic dynamics, Kalecki fused the class-based analysis of capitalism, realization crisis derived from Marx and Rosa Luxemburg, with what he called a rising degree of monopoly reflected in Marx's surplus value, developing a uniform theory of accumulation under monopoly capitalism. So Kalecki propounded the theory of accumulation under monopoly capitalism. As Kalecki wrote, and I quote him, "Monopoly appears to be deeply rooted in the nature of the capitalist system. Free competition, as an assumption, may be useful in the first stage of certain investigations, but as a description of the normal stages of capitalist economy, it is merely a myth." Kalecki therefore shifted the basis of inadequate aggregate demand from underconsumption, an obvious feature of poverty in all societies, to underinvestment, which prevents the full realization of profit. He went further and tried to show that the crucial function in a capitalist economic system of the price mechanism is not simply to make supply is equal to demand in markets, a commonplace for merchant capitalism, but it lies in determining the distribution of profits among capitalist firms. It is through their manipulation of prices in markets that corporations or monopoly capitalists secure for themselves a disproportionate share of the profits realized through investment and trade in the economy. This again develops insights previously founded or put forth by Hilferding and Marx. But at this juncture, it should be pointed out that monopoly is not the outcome of operations in markets for goods and services where monopolies seem to have a dominant position, but instead is a result of their operations in the capital market. The dominant corporations of today, such as General Electric, Tata, Microsoft, did not achieve their preeminence through their ability to produce electrical equipment, steel or aircraft or software better than others. but by buying up those competitors in the stock market. This is how monopoly capitalism works. Now, this argument of Michael Kalecki has been put forth by Joseph Stendhal, a young Austrian economist who was one of Kalecki's colleagues at the Oxford Institute of Statistics during the Second World War. Stendhal's work, Maturity and Stagnation in American Capitalism, first published in 1952, explored the causes of the Great Depression in the 1930s, contending that growing monopolization raises profit margins in core industries. This led to excess capacity as large firms protected their higher margins in the face of weaknesses in demand by reducing capacity utilization rather than prices. Excess capacity dampened the rate of growth or investment. Here, stagnation or slow growth and widening unemployment and underemployment and idle capacity represented the dominant economic trend. Stendhal's work argued that monopoly capital could use its control of markets to prevent the elimination of excess capital in the economy. He would also focus on the fact that in competitive capitalism, getting rid of excess capacity is the precondition of an economic recovery where firms' investment restarts if only to replace worn out machinery. According to Stendhal, corporations continue operating under excess capacity, covering up the high costs of their excess from their monopoly profits. However, the unused capacity discourages fixed investment in the economy and hence maintains a regime of economic stagnation due to underinvestment. Let us move on to another very important theory on monopoly capitalism put forth by Paul Baran and Paul Sweezy. Monopoly Capital, published by Baran and Sweezy in 1966, was considered to be a path-breaking work in the theorization of monopoly capitalism. Their work, Monopoly Capital, took the Kalecki-Stendhal framework as its initial point of departure, seeking to draw out from the wider societal implications. In their view, Marx's law of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall associated with the stage of free competition has been replaced in the monopoly capitalist stage by a law of the tendency of the surplus to rise. This economic surplus was defined as the difference between total social output and the socially necessary labor cost of producing it. The surplus concept was employed as a complementary category to the classical concept of surplus value, facilitating the explorations of contradictions specific to monopoly capitalism, such as the growing role of waste in production, which were not easily addressed using the surplus value category. Now, the argument of monopoly capital focused on the critical problem of surplus absorption as the chief contradiction in the state of accumulation. What do we do with surplus? Now, surplus could be absorbed in any one of the following ways. It can be consumed, it can be invested, or it can be wasted. These are the three ways you can absorb the surplus. Capitalist consumption accounted for the decreasing share of demand as income grew, while investment took the form of new productive forces which served to inhibit new net investment. Although there was always the possibility that new epoch-making innovations resembling the steam engine, the electric motor, the railroad, the automobiles, etc. would emerge, allowing the system to break free from the stagnation tendency, such as massive capital-absorbing innovations, by definition few and far between. Hence, the system of private accumulation, if led to itself, exhibited a powerful tendency to stagnation according to Sweezy and Baran. if periods of rapid growth nonetheless occurred. Barron and Sweezy, please note, were writing at the time of high point of the post-Second World War expansion, and this was due to such countervailing factors to stagnation as sales effort, military spending, and financial expansion. All such countervailing factors were, however, of a self-limiting character and could be expected to lead to bigger contradictions in the future. According to them, difficulties in monopoly capital are caused not by a lack of profit but by unabsorbed surplus. If monopoly capital is no longer able to absorb the surplus, it is capable of producing any further increase in the productivity of labor which would enlarge the surplus still further, would force monopoly capital into still more restrictions on production. With the resultant growth of idle resources, capital accumulation, that is, the capitalist mode of production, would come to an end. The work of Barron and Sweezy was taken forward by Harry Beverman, who in his path-breaking work, Labor and Monopoly Capital, published in 1974, making it clear that the degradation of work brought on by the division of labor, as Marx had described in The Capital, was in many ways heightened under monopoly capitalism with the rise of scientific management. Let us move on with the very recent work on monopoly capitalism put forth by Colling and John Bellamy Foster. In contrast to a number of radical Marxist theories, including Keith Colling in Monopoly Capitalism and John Bellamy Foster in The Theory of Monopoly Capitalism, published in 1986, they argued that with increasing force that the reality was one of concentration and centralization of capital on a world scale. What we find is the internationalization of monopoly capital, with fewer and fewer firms controlling large parts of both national and international economies. This was coupled with the institution of divide and rule in relation to global labor. Nevertheless, the main focus of monopoly capital theorists since the 1980s was not directed so much at debates about the status of monopoly capital, but at explaining the onset of economic stagnation beginning in the mid-1970s and how financialization emerged as a countervailing factor, thereby lifting the economy. Key works in this regard were Macduff and Sweezy's Stagnation and Financial Explosion in 1987, followed by the Irreversible Crisis in 1988. In 1997, Sweezy argued that monopolization and stagnation had led to the emergence of a new layer of contradictions in the system, which is summed up as the financialization of the capital accumulation process. Now, what is the status of monopoly capitalism in the 21st century? Beginning around 2000, theorists in the monopoly capital tradition began to develop the notion of new phase of monopoly capitalism or monopoly finance capital, in which monopolization, stagnation, and financialization operated simultaneously and mutually reinforcing trends. Foster and Fred Macduff explored this particular thesis in their Great Financial Crisis work. In another work, The Endless Crisis, published in 2012, Foster were among the first to argue that the weakening of the financialization as a result of the crisis of 2007 to 2009, secular stagnation was likely to persist in the indefinite future. Meanwhile, Samir Amin, writing on the law of the worldwide value, published in 2011, declared that we are living in the late capitalism of generalized, financialized, and globalized oligopolies. Let us quickly summarize what we have studied so far. 100 years ago, Lenin concluded that capitalism had entered a new historical stage which he called imperialism. He defined imperialism as that state of capitalism in which the dominance of monopoly and finance capital has established itself, in which export of capital has acquired pronounced importance, in which the division of the world among the international trust had begun, in which the division of all the territories among the globe, the biggest capitalist powers, has been completed. Similarly, we find writings about monopoly capitalism in recent works. A striking paradox animates political economy in our times. On the one hand, we find mainstream economics and much of the left economics discuss our era as one of the intense increased competition among businesses on a global scale. It is a matter so self-evident as no longer required empirical verification or scholarly examination. On the other hand, wherever one looks, it seems that nearly every industry is concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. This is the law of the day. Formerly competitive sectors like retail, if you see it yourselves around, are now the province of enormous monopolistic chains. Massive economic fortunes are being assembled in the hands of few large billionaires, striking atop vast empires, and the new firms and industries spawned by the digital revolution have quickly gravitated into a monopoly status. In short, monopoly power is ascendant as never before. Finally, as John Kenneth Galbraith noted in 2004 in The Economics of Innocent Fraud, the phrase monopoly capitalism, once in common use, has been dropped from the academic and political lexicon. For the neoliberal ideologues of today, there is only one issue: state versus capital. Economic power is no longer deemed relevant. Monopoly power, not to mention monopoly capital, is non-existent or unimportant. This is the other side of the debate. Some in the left would definitely agree with this. Finally, let us quickly conclude what we have studied in a single sentence. Monopolistic firms today influence prices, control supply, erect barriers to entry of others, manipulate consumer demand in order to maintain their dominance. What we find today is the rise of mega monopolies in the contemporary world. Thank you.